Hello, everyone. My name is Talia Marshall, and I worked with Professor Marsh on this project, which is called Translating Jarchar, Makina as the Kharja of Yuri Herrera's Signs Preceding the End of the World. And I'm hoping that if you need it, there is a link to my document of what I'm going to say if you want to follow along or if you prefer to read the presentation. Okay. Throughout his novel Signs Preceding the End of the World, Yuri Herrera uses the verb jarchar, which has been translated by Lisa Dillman to traverse in English. The word has baffled Mexican Spanish speakers, who think it's a word from Spain, Spanish speakers, who think it's a word from Mexico, and even Dillman herself. Jarchar is actually a verb coined by Herrera, who decided that he wanted to use it without any explanation and that he would use it very loosely as a synonym for going out or going between one place and another, as you can see in the quote on the screen. In this paper, I will examine the final pages of the novel and Makina's character in order to take seriously Herrera's invention of this verb to discuss 1. The new verb's roots in medieval poetry, 2. The meanings of those roots in the context of signs preceding the end of the world, and 3. How Makina's character enacts the form of the Kharja in the discourse of the novel. In my analysis, I rely on Caroline Levine's theory of affordances and constraints from her book Forms, Whole, Rhythm, Hierarchy, Network. For Levine, a form always indicates an arrangement of elements, an ordering, patterning, or shaping. She also defines affordances, which are, quote, the potential uses or actions latent in materials and designs. In Signs, Herrera plays with the form of the Kharja and its affordances to create a new form in the verb jarchar, which comes with its own set of affordances and constraints. In inventing the verb jarchar, hopefully you can see what's on the screen. In inventing the verb jarchar, Herrera drew on the medieval poetry form of the Kharja, Kharja in Spanish, which refers to the final strophe of the muashashat, which is a form of highly structured performative poetry that was developed in Al-Andalus or Muslim Iberia around the 10th century, and they were mostly about love, wine, or praise, so similar to an ode. The word Kharja itself translates from Arabic to mean exit, departure, projection, or conspicuous part. And the Kharja was also sometimes referred to as a markas, or central point, since the entire poem's structure was dictated and built around the structure of the Kharja. They were usually written in vernacular as opposed to the more formal dialect of the rest of the poem, and most of them borrowed text from a different poem or song. The speaker of the poem shifted with the Kharja, typically to a female speaker saying goodbye. I have a few more notes that are on the screen right now if you want to pause to read more about the general structure of the Kharja. And here, if you want to pause, hopefully my little picture is not in the way. If you want to pause, you can read an example of a Kharja. There was no author given when I found it, but it was translated by J.T. Moore. While the entire Muashashat is important, it simply could not exist without its Kharja. One of the earliest Kharja scholars, Ibn Sana al-Mulk, wrote in his late 12th century treatise on Arabic poetry that, quote, the Kharja is the spice of the Muashashat, its salt and sugar, its musk and amber. It is the close of the Muashashat, it must therefore be beautiful. It is its seal, nay, it is the beginning, although it is at the end. Herrera transmutes the Kharja form through the creation of the verb jarchar, moving from the larger form of literary term to the larger form of verb. This transmutation is signaled through both the verb jarchar and the character of Makina, who takes on the form of the Kharja for the novel. Hopefully you can see that. To explain exactly what I mean when I say that Makina is the Kharja of the novel, I will look at the final scene in which Makina takes on a new identity in the United States, effectively completing her Harcha from Makina to the person she turns into in the United States and killing the person Makina. Herrera writes, quote, she began to descend, turned to see if Chucho was following, but he had stayed at the door, blew her a kiss, moved out of the frame, and Makina caught a glimpse of the last rays of sun. Then she went on down. Much like the female speaker of the Kharja uses the strophe to say goodbye, this scene is at the end of Makina's novel-long farewell to her community, her home, and herself. Makina then walks through a door with a sign over it that says verse, or harcha in the Spanish version of the novel, into a room described as, quote, like a sleepwalker's bedroom. This physical movement through the door from a stairwell into a room also follows the poetic structure of the Muashashat. The Kharja is the final strophe of the poem. A strophe is a collection of stanzas, and a stanza translates from Italian to mean room. Thus, walking through this doorway physically signals a transition akin to the transition from the body of the Muashashat to the Kharja. As Makina walked through the door, Herrera writes that she, quote, tried to remember how to say verse in any of her tongues but couldn't. This was the only word that came to her lips, verse. Jarchar, or in this case, to verse, gains extra significance in this moment because in the original Spanish text, the word she remembers is harcha, but in the English translation, the word she remembers is the English verse, despite the fact that the Spanish version's Makina and the English translation's Makina are supposedly the same person. Since most readers of the English edition of Signs likely do not understand Spanish or the history of the Kharja that I've outlined thus far, it would be unrealistic to expect Makina to remember Harcha rather than verse in the English version. Makina's memory of verse rather than Harchar highlights the limited affordances of the translated form of the novel. By the end of the scene, Makina's entire world slips away as she completes her descent into Miglan. Quote, the turmoil of so many new things crowding in on the old ones was more than she could take. But a second, or many, later, she stopped feeling the weight of uncertainty and guilt. She thought back to her people as though recalling the contours of a lovely landscape that was now fading away. The village, the little town, the big Chilango, all those colors, and she saw that what was happening was not a cataclysm. She understood with all of her body and all of her memory. She truly understood, and when everything in the world fell silent, finally said to herself, I'm ready. Without even using the word harchar, these final sentences convey the same meaning as the verb. They describe Makina's, quote, poetic exit from the world. This final scene could be described using the medieval Kharja form as the Kharja of the novel based on location in the text and tone alone. At the same time, Makina enacts Herrera's transmuted form of the Kharja. Throughout the novel, she is constantly moving between, switching languages, conveying messages, and crossing literal borders. Since she's the main character and one of only 3 characters that are even given a name, the novel was built around her, similar to the way in which medieval poets built their muashashat around the Kharja. While the Kharja dictated the muashashat structure, Makina's centrality means that the novel is told from a limited third-person perspective. We understand many of Makina's thoughts and impulses and see the world mostly through her eyes. Makina is, therefore, as essential to signs as the Kharja is to the muashashat. The verb harchar seems to enact 2 related functions in the novel. First, the way that harchar, and therefore the Kharja, can be connected and identified with Makina, as I outlined in my analysis of the final pages of the novel. Concurrently, the discourse of the translated novel specifically enacts a profound form of alienation, since the translated to verse is unable to carry the foundation of medieval Al-Andalusian poetry that Herrera used to build harchar. The text ambivalence between identification and alienation is a complex effect of the verb's invention, which takes on increased significance when the novel is translated, as to verse sheds the meaning of harchar when it is translated. To take this one step further, I turn finally to Michael McKeon's insight from The Origins of the English Novel, 1600 to 1740, which is that, quote, the novel attains its modern institutional stability and coherence at this time being 1600 to 1740, because of its unrivaled power to both to formulate and to explain a set of problems that are central to early modern experience. While McKeon is only speaking directly about the early English novel, what he says also seems to hold true for the contemporary novel translated into English. The form of the text and its sometimes incompatibility with translation, as we see with Harchar, begin to disclose the possibilities and problems of globalization. Here's my works cited. Feel free to pause if you want to check my citations or check any of them out. And if you want to learn more about the Kharja more generally, the structure and the meaning, check out this book, the second one. And if you want to just read more Kharjas, this one is the big one. It was like a big collection. That was a big deal when it came out. Thank you. And I'm looking forward to hearing everyone's questions on Wednesday.